Hi everyone. My name is Tiara Richards. This week I really enjoyed reading our chapters 1 through 6 and then chapter 2. It definitely confirmed some things that I've experienced through work, and I also learned a whole lot. I really appreciate everyone being here and listening to my perspective of this week's readings. So for chapters 1 through 3, it seemed to really focus on foundations, biology, and brain development. Specifically in chapter 1, the tracking how childhood social development evolved. It kind of, at a certain point, seemed to turn from more of a philosophical perspective to a more scientifical perspective, which kind of allowed it to have a spectrum and a number and something to kind of evaluate or gauge, which I think is a positive turn. In chapter 2, it seemed to focus on behavioral genetics. So, like, it kind of goes deeper into the nurture versus nature concept, which I am familiar with the nurture versus nature concept, but this in chapter 2 went much more in depth, which I certainly appreciate. It kind of this gave you a broader spectrum, like how environmental factors play more into the nurture versus nature than I think we really think about. Um, but yeah, it helped me really get a deeper concept of that, and I do appreciate that. In chapter 3, there was a social brain understanding and how specific brain networks work and mature during childhood to support the more complex social interactions. Like, as a child, we interact with our parents first, so that's kind of like a basic interaction. But as we get older and our relationships become more mature and complex, we have to learn how to, or a child develops into learning how to interact in a more complex social way. But to kind of put an example to the nurture versus nature deep dive, I think you could kind of use an example of like generalized anxiety. That's something that studies have shown can be genetically inherited and not an environmentally factor that kind of triggers it. Of course, there are things that situational, environmental that will trigger your anxiety, but it's also been proven that it can be inherited. So, that goes into the nurture versus nature concept. So, chapters 4 and 5 tend to focus on evolutionary and historical concepts of childhood. What I took from chapters 4 and 5 was there seems to be a key tension that balances biological factors with cultural factors, like what culture and society deems childlike or childhood. Um, because even today, different cultures take a different look at what childhood is and even what is appropriate at what age. Um, it kind of reminds us that behaviors like stranger anxiety or deep parental attachment aren't just random. They're kind of really tied to survival mechanisms that are passed down through generations. So there's like this cultural fear of something that tends to pick up, for a certain amount of years, and it just continues to trickle down, and there's no real rhyme or reason. It just is the way it is, type of a thing. Um, Historically, children aren't always viewed as innocent and needing protection, but a sacred stage of human development. So that's what I took from chapters 4 and 5. So for chapter 6, I kind of got a compare and contrast between these two ideas. Um, the key takeaway that I got from chapter 6 was that a child's social development cannot be decoupled from their socially economic status or cultural background. It just kind of shows that parenting isn't just a personal choice, it's highly policed by society. And intensive modern parenting does put a lot of pressure on parents, and it micromanages every aspect of certain social landscapes, just from the high policing of how you're expected to parent. Um, Social class also drastically alters the success of things like, access to public certain schools, access to certain, extracurricular activities and things of that nature. So, for this section, what I took away from this the most is there are a lot of genetic disorders, behavioral genetic disorders, birth defects, genotypes, phenotypes, chromosomes, parental development, and all types of different physical aspects that really play into childhood development. So I think this is where things like autism and things of that nature come into play. Um, you can dive into each one of these genetic disorders and really take away a breakdown of how it impacts childhood development if the child is in fact impacted by one of these things, which according to a lot of research, there's a high number of autistic children and children who have special needs and genetic disorders. Thank you.